Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third and final webinar of I Wish I'd Known. This is a workshop for parents and carers about young people, drugs and decisions. My name's Diane Harrison and I'm the lead within Cumberland Council for Youth Substance Misuse. And my team, alongside colleagues from Westmoreland and Furness, are working with the Daniel Spargo MABS Foundation on different initiatives around drug education, of which this is one. My service works with young people on a one-to-one basis to offer them non-judgmental support, education and coaching to help them make informed choices about drugs and or alcohol to minimise or reduce harm to both themselves and others. And I'll come back and say a little bit more about this later on. One of the main ambitions for our work is that parents and carers are able to have open conversations about drugs and or alcohol with young people. And so I'll pass you across to Asha, who will take you through the session today.
Thank you very much, Diane. So I'm Asha, this is Sam here. We are both drugs educators at the DSM Foundation. Sam's going to disappear just while I do a brief introduction, and then he will be back very shortly because he and I will be sharing the presenting between us this evening. I'm just going to start with the housekeeping, very important. Do use the chat function if you've got any issues in terms of accessing this webinar. We will pick things up to try and sort anything out. We do a lot of these. It does tend to be a local issue that stops people kind of being able to hear things or see things, but do flag it up and we will try and help. And sometimes it can be a problem at our end as well. We're also going to be using the chat function here and there, and we also have a couple of polls that we're going to be launching. We will tell you what to do and when the moment comes, so don't worry about that, but please do participate because it does make it kind of a lot more interesting for you as well as for us. Some of you will have completed a survey that came out beforehand. Thank you to those of you who did, because it has meant that we've been able to tailor what we're talking about. And a few of you did also ask questions about things that you were kind of specifically concerned about. So some of those we were going to be covering anyway, which is great. But we've also made a note of those questions, and we have allocated some time at the end to answer any questions that anybody might have. Now, if you do have questions during this, we have the Q&A set up. And the reason we would urge you to submit things using the Q&A rather than the chat is because if you submit them through the Q&A, you can tick anonymous. And with a lot of this kind of thing, people do prefer to be anonymous. We would never say who anybody is anyway. So please do rest assured that confidentiality is key. But do post any questions about anything that you'd like to know. My background is that I'm a pharmacist and a health journalist, and I've been at the foundation for 5.5 years. Sam will tell you a little bit more about his background when he comes along. He comes from a slightly different angle to me, but between us we have got a lot of knowledge and experience and expertise in all of this stuff, so we are good people to ask. The final thing is that we pack a lot of information into these sessions, and that's a really important aspect because there's just a lot of stuff that we think it's really useful for you to know. And so do feel free to take screenshots, to write things down as we go through, but also please know that there is the facility at the end to download an information leaflet, and that's got a lot of the key slides as well as actually additional information, so links into kind of further resources, videos that you can watch and things like that. So we will be providing a link for you to be able to access that towards the end. So please know that you're getting that, so you don't have to scribble things down if you don't want to. And we are also recording this session, and we are going to combine the 3 webinars that we've done for the schools in the area, for parents of those schools in the area, and that recording will be made available through Diane's service over the next week or so. So again, if there's anything that you wanted to revisit, or there's someone else that you think might find it useful to watch this, then that is going to be made available to them. So let me just quickly run through the objectives. So you can see here that we're the DSM Foundation. We've been going for 10 years, and what we're going to be covering during this session is what we think young people and also parents and caregivers in our 10 years of experience need to know about the risks of drugs and alcohol, and also the way that young people go about their decision making and the factors that do influence the choices that they make, because they are different to how adults come to their decisions. Some conversation starters and some strategies that you can pass on that will just help them to stay just that little bit safer, and also how to know and what to do if you have concerns about your child using drugs. We're also going to be doing some signposting for more information and support, including to some local provision for you. But where I'm going to start is where we started as an organisation.
I'm Fiona Spargo-Mabs. I'm the director and founder of the Daniel Spargo-Mabs Foundation, which is a drug education charity my husband Tim and I set up when our son Dan died when he was 16, taking MDMA, ecstasy. Let me tell you about Dan. Dan was my bright, big-hearted, funny, kind, chatty younger son. Everyone loved Dan, in school and out. You couldn't help yourself. It could be so annoying, but he was annoying in the most funny, endearing kind of way. He just loved being friends with everyone, and he was really good at making friends with everyone. He was overwhelmingly voted prom king at the end of his year 11, which is basically a popularity test. He'd gone into sixth form at school and he was doing really well. Best ever parents' evening. He'd been in the school production, The Wiz, just before Christmas. He'd signed up as a bone marrow donor. He'd been going out with his lovely girlfriend Jenna for more than 2 years. He was in a really good place. Got to January, he came home from school on a Friday and asked if it was okay to go to a party that evening. So I asked all those usual questions about where would it be and when would he be back and who'd be there. And there were things about it that were a bit unusual. So we had a little bit of to and fro about this party and whether it was or wasn't okay. But in the end, I said yes. And it turned out it wasn't a party. It wasn't where he said it was. It wasn't who he said he'd be with. It was an illegal rave, miles from our home. It was mostly boys from another school, friends of a new friend of Dan's, who'd joined the school for sixth form, who'd got this plan to go to this rave and a plan that some of them would take MDMA, which I'd never heard of. I'd heard of ecstasy, and now I know MDMA is the chemical in ecstasy, but comes in crystal form. So there were 8 boys, 5 of them taking MDMA. One of them was Dan. Apparently, they all dissolved their MDMA in water. According to Dan's friend Jack, who was one of the 3 that wasn't taking anything, and my only source of information, the other 4 boys sipped theirs all the way there to the rave, which took them hours. And Jack said all the way there he could see Dan was holding his back, watching the others, just being a bit wary and hesitant. And Jack didn't say anything because he didn't want to draw attention to it in case Dan wanted to sneak it away. But on that very last train, someone else spotted him holding on to his and said, "Are you not having that then?" And Dan had it. He was fine for a couple of hours, but then he collapsed. He was rushed to hospital. We had the police knocking at our door, raced there as quickly as we could, and spent the next 2 days in intensive care watching Dan die from multiple organ failure. What did it for Dan was the fact the little bag of MDMA he got turned out to be 12 times stronger than had caused fatality in the past. One of the risks with illegal drugs, that unknown quantity, no way of telling by looking. After Dan died, we learned this wasn't the first time, but it was only the 3rd time. It turned out he'd been on a very short journey when it came to drugs, just a few months. So Dan was friends with literally everyone, every friendship group, and that included a group for whom drug taking had become quite a normal thing. A friend had given him a little of her MDMA to try at a gig a couple of months before he died. And then at another gig, a bit later, she got him and another friend some of their own from her dealer. Now, that hadn't been a good experience for Dan or for her, and we could see from the text on his phone this had really shaken him. And then there's this rave, and he was clearly being really wary about going at all, coming out with lots of excuses, some of them very random and not true at all, but he was persuaded by this friend over a long text exchange, and apparently everyone had been on at him to go. It had been the talk of the whole sixth form common room that day. Everything was more fun when Dan was there, and he was perfectly capable of saying no. So there must have been a bit of him that was persuadable. And of course, nobody meant him to come to any harm, but he did. as parents, we didn't feel we were ignorant about drugs. We'd even been on a 6-week course for parents about young people and drugs, but when the boys were a bit younger. And we'd had conversations at home about drugs, some specifically about ecstasy. As I said, Dan was endlessly chatty and curious about everything and always wanted to know what you thought about everything. But I just didn't know enough, and neither did Dan, to make sure that he could stay safe. And that's why we started this charity, to make sure other young people and their parents were better armed than we had been. We knew we needed to do absolutely everything we could to prevent any harm of any sort happening to anyone else's child. I do realise I represent every parent's worst nightmare, and I always want to reassure people that there are very few of us, thankfully. It doesn't often go quite this badly wrong. But drugs and alcohol can and do cause all sorts of shades of harm and damage, and they're all totally avoidable. So for parents, it's about empowerment, not nightmares, helping them to help their children to make safer choices about drugs.
This is a lot of what we do, talking to parents and carers, but actually the bulk of our work is in schools. And there's lots of things that we do, from kind of in-person workshops to webinars. We can do live streaming. And there's also a play that has been touring around most of the schools in your area. And it tells the story of what happened to Dan in the words of his friends and his family, including those who were with him that night. It's just another way of accessing those really important messages. And afterwards, the students have a short workshop from the cast themselves, just enabling them again to just explore some of those themes and take on some really practical things that they can do to try and keep themselves and their friends safe. Obviously, what happened to Dan is a worst case scenario, but the reality is that harm does come to people regularly from using drugs and alcohol, and I'm sure you've sometimes seen people in a bit of a state for one reason or another. And so what this is about really is about just informing and empowering young people, but also their caregivers, because you do have a massive impact on what they do, and just enabling those conversations to be had, because doing so is actually a massive protective factor. With that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to hand over to Sam. He's going to take you through the first part of this webinar, and then I will be back a bit later, and then we'll just kind of flip back and forth. So over to you, Sam.
Hi everyone, so I'm Sam. I'm one of the drug educators with the DSM Foundation. So going off of that great point that Asha started us off with, I wanted to just start with a question for all of you, which is, where do you think young people get information about drugs? If you want to just pop it in the chat, it will be to hosts and panelists, so I'll be able to see it, and other people in the session won't be able to see it. And I'll just have a look at what's coming in. So we're getting people saying from their friends. Actually, yeah, so far everyone has said their friends. We're also seeing things like parents, school, social media, the internet, other young people, online. Great. Films and TV as well. It's also worth considering what we're exposed to. Right, so that's a really good start. Gaming as well. So we're going to see stuff all over the place. There's a slight difference between alcohol and drugs in terms of how people are exposed and where people get their information. So we do. What no one had mentioned, or we had one person mention, is a lot of it comes from parents and teachers. Yes, some of it will still be the internet, TV, other relatives, social media, maybe their friends, but their friends, which was pretty much a response that came straight away from a lot of people who just responded. Yes, a significant part. And then with drugs, we start with parents, going into teachers again, internet. So we have a similar spread, even though slightly lower, and then social media, and then at the end, other relatives and friends. So yes, friends are people they will hear from, but when we ask young people, so this is through the NHS data, where they want to get information, who they think they can trust and talk to, it's still going to come up with their parents, their teachers, and yes, sometimes the internet, they'll start looking as well. The internet, we start having some issues around what's reliable. And the same is a fear you might have as a parent, is whether you can talk about this and whether you can have these conversations. So one really big takeaway, of course, that we want from this session is that you're comfortable starting these conversations and that you believe in what you have to say and that you feel knowledgeable about this. So do take notes, do take as much time as you can to take things in during the session, or if you feel like you have to follow them up, that's great as well. But what we really want you to remember is you can have these conversations, and you're actually really helpful and are reliable and trustworthy to young people. So to start us off with a definition, when we're looking at drugs and when we're talking about different substances, as just our baseline definition, we're talking about any substance that interferes with the brain's natural communication networks. So whether that means it is blocking regular signals, whether it is stimulating them, it changes different messaging in the brain. So when we mention messaging, what I'm referring to is things like serotonin, dopamine, adrenaline, so natural neurotransmitters, which we already have, which are responsible for the way we respond to things and might be responsible for different parts of our body, be it our heart rate, our breathing rate, but it's also going to react and have a reaction in terms of how we feel and how we see the world around us. So a substance is something that affects our feelings, our thoughts, our behavior, and the way we perceive the world by acting on these natural processes. So you might already have a bit of an idea of what comes up for you when we have that as a definition. So if people could again take to the chat and just type in what drugs you've already heard of and what's out there. Let's see, people have mentioned dope, pot, and cannabis, Entonox is laughing gas, alcohol, spice, ketamine. This is a good spread. Edibles, so that will be people eating cannabis, crack, coke, smack, ketamine, weed, speed, cannabis, heroin, speed, more amphetamine, acid, prescription drugs, ecstasy, LSD. So really good suggestions, everyone. I'm going to touch on a few of these. And we have a bit of a difference here in terms of some things that were mentioned might have been a general category, like a prescription drug. Some are the name of a substance, like heroin, and some might be a nickname, like crack, or like pot, or dope. So we have these different names for different things, which can change how we have conversations around substances and how we get accurate information as well. So when we ask young people, so this is from our survey data, which is, I believe, year 11 onwards. We asked this before we go into schools to see what young people perceive to be commonly used. So this doesn't necessarily match up with what they're actually taking. This is what they're exposed to and what they think is common. And right at the top, we have vaping and alcohol. Some schools this swaps around. Then we have cannabis, slightly less. Smoke, still very predominant. Cigarettes, cannabis when it's eaten as edible. So we're talking about either gummies there or things like cookies and brownies with cannabis in them. Nitrous oxide, so that's laughing gas or Entonox. Ketamine is then a bit lower. So already we're much lower in terms of what people perceive, but it's still commonly around. MDMA or ecstasy, which is the drug that Dan passed away from, performance-enhancing steroids. And then we have our LSD, so our psychedelics sort of lowered down with magic mushrooms. And right at the bottom, benzodiazepines, and then other. Sometimes with other, we have young people telling us names of substances that are already listed. They just don't necessarily realize it's the same thing. So they might give us a nickname, or it might be something more obscure as well. So how do they work? We're kind of going to go through a few different categories just to start us off with. So we have our stimulants. These are drugs that generally increase the heart rate, increase people's response to things. Now, I'm not going to go too much into detail for each substance because this is, if you have an interest in a particular substance, we have some great resources for you to do more reading on this. You want to spend more time looking at behaviors, but I'll still go into this quite a bit. So we have nicotine. It's still a stimulant, but what people might perceive to be relaxing, so having a cigarette to relax, is usually due to withdrawals because people haven't had nicotine a long time and they feel like they need more. MDMA or ecstasy, so you might have heard of it either as crystal or powder or pills. And we're going to have a look later how in reality, so there might be some myths around what is stronger, what is purer, whether there are other substances in there, what is less risky. But we know in reality there is similar risks to both because it is just the same drug, and in both forms it's a legal substance, and hence we have the results of a legal market. We have cocaine, a short-acting stimulant known for being very addictive, making people quite aggressive, and steroids are also a stimulant. In the presence, we have our well-known one, of course, it is alcohol. So that makes people slower to react, might make people sleepy. We'll talk a bit about alcohol later. Xanax and benzo. So benzodiazepines is a class of drug. It helps people who might be prescribed it for anxiety. It can be quite helpful for that. Xanax is a brand name for that. But then you might also hear of things like alprazolam, atizolam, all kind of names ending with zam, and that's the actual chemical name. So we have different names based on classification or brand name or the actual substance. So that can get a little bit in the way of some messaging in terms of talking and in terms of having these conversations and giving accurate information. And also one person might go, well, it's not this, it's this other thing, when they might be the same class and hence have the same risks. Now with cannabis is a really good example here with both whether it's being eaten or whether it's being smoked, how different ways of consuming can affect risk. So we'll talk in detail about cannabis later as a substance, but one extra risk with edibles, which we'll touch on later as well, is that they can take a longer time to have an effect, hit someone more strongly, so they can't predict really how intense it's going to be in advance, and then they can be overwhelmed more easily. With our psychedelics, we have our classics like LSD or acid or magic mushrooms. With year 7, I obviously frequently have to point out that magic here is just a nickname. The actual substance in there is psilocybin, and these are very much affected by someone's mindset going into them, and they last a much longer time than these other substances. So one of my jobs is I work at festivals and in nightlife in clubs in welfare. So we look after people who are unwell. With these, we might be with someone for 6, 8, 12 hours. Just to talk them through the experience. Whereas with a different substance that lasts a shorter time, it might be a very quick, okay, you're sober again, you're back in a room, we can talk about what's happened, off you go. So that might be the case with things like dissociatives such as ketamine. Now, ketamine, our worry in terms of risk is long-term bladder damage, but more short-term, people being vulnerable because they seem to forget where they are. They're not really as aware of their body, which is similar to what we get with nitrous oxide. So show of hands, which will work, but show of hands if you've seen any of these canisters anywhere. You might have seen them near parks, you might have seen them near schools. That's nitrous oxide. Entonox, which can get given to people in a hospital setting or an ambulance setting, it's the same substance, but combined with oxygen. So if someone is having lots of nitrous oxide in one go, they are essentially holding their breath. There's a risk of just suffocation, but more really short-term brain damage from not breathing enough oxygen, and long-term we have nerve damage associated with B12. So that's a bunch of different substances. There's probably more you've heard of. There's more nicknames you would have heard of. If you have questions on specific ones, do ask us, and we're going to ask some questions at the end, and of course give you some resources as well. So with Dan, that night that he went out, 5 of them had MDMA shared between them, and they dissolved it in these bottles of water. So they thought they were all having an equal amount and that they were just quickly sharing it, and that they'd all feel the same amount. But what Dan ended up taking was 12 times higher than had caused fatality in the past. And there is no way he could have known that without having it tested, or without it being a regulated medication, or having all these safety procedures in place that we would have with like a regulated medicine. And part of that was, of course, the pressure he was under with people goading him on to take it, with being excited going to a party, not knowing what to expect. So I'm just going to give you an example of a few of the other risks that we have with substances, which is more general in terms of approaching different substances. So with illegal substances, they aren't really made the same way as medication might be. So here are some pictures from a Vice documentary interviewing some people crushing and then weighing and mixing together some pills, some MDMA to press them into pills. These guys are adding all sorts in. They're admitting so on camera. I just want you to take a moment and have a look at these pictures and see what might stand out to you in terms of the standards. Can people just pop in the chat, actually? If you just want to type in the chat what you think these guys are doing wrong, or what might show that they don't really care about their end product, or they don't really care about what they're giving to people. Dirty environment, yeah. So we have dust everywhere. This is done on the floor. A cracked container, which is, yeah, just a takeaway container. It is very dirty, so some of that might be the substance they're trying to use. Some of that might be MDMA. Some of it might be the binder. If they're handling any other substances, these could probably contaminate the pills. Dirty, rusty kitchen tools. There are some weighing scales, but they're not particularly great ones. They're, as in, it's not lab equipment. Things you can't really tell, but the little stirrer there is just a bit of paper torn off a chicken takeaway box. So these guys aren't producing something and going out saying this is something we've quickly made on the cheap. They're going out and saying this is a high quality product. And of course, some dealers might somehow be interested in having a better quality product, and there's a variety out there. But we know there is no way anyone can trust anyone selling an illegal product that isn't regulated. And we know that because there are organizations out there that test different substances. So the Loop tests different substances at festivals and at city centers, but only for people with persistent substance use problems. So here are a few of alerts that they have put out on some different pills of MDMA. There are loads of these. They're all public information. I've taken a few of these pictures having done work with them. So that goes for pills being either very strong or there's different strengths in there, so it's inconsistent. We have things like blotters that would have LSD on them, having substances that can last much longer, 2 to 4 times longer, or could have a much higher physical risk of someone overdosing. We have substances that look very much like MDMA, but actually last much longer. In this case, it's N-ethylpentylone. Here we have an alert from a few years back where we have 3 different pills which contain 3 different substances and they're different colors. Here we have another, is a dipentylone. Then we have yet another substance. So here it's a high dose of MDMA. But what I want you to have as a takeaway from this is the drug market is very unreliable and unpredictable. And it does change from year to year, and one year people might be very worried in the field. So I've worked with the Loop and tested drugs for them. I work in the lab. So we might have 1 year, one worrying substance really substituting MDMA a lot. Maybe something else is being found in the drug supply. You might see things on the news. There's no point worrying about a particular substance because it just changes year on year. So it's so unpredictable and the market's constantly changing. The risk stays there. It'll just be a different substance. And that's always the risk. It's that it's unpredictable and an unknown and something new. So when we look at risk, we're really looking at the 3 major things being the drug, that's the individual different risks that different substances have, but also how they might be contaminated or what they might be instead. We have the person. That's the important bit when we're talking to the young person. What is it that they have done to look after themselves? How much have they eaten, rested? How relaxed are they? Do they have any underlying mental health conditions or physical health conditions? Are they on medication? And the place, is it really hot? Is it cool? Is there somewhere to take a break? What is it that they need? So all those add up into the risk for that individual. So when we ask young people which substances cause the most problems for them, we pretty much consistently come up with the same thing. So I'm going to talk about these in detail. It's going to be vaping with nicotine, alcohol, and then cannabis or weed or marijuana, same substance. So vaping has become a very popular way for people to stop smoking cigarettes. It's great because people can still have their nicotine without having the same associated risks of burning something and breathing it in. But it's still addictive because there's still nicotine in there. So for young people, we know if they start vaping, they're 3 times more likely to then pick up smoking. So we have this habit, this technique that's developed to help people stop smoking, that for young people increases the risk of them starting smoking to begin with. There are unregulated vapes out there. They might be very strong, so have high amounts of nicotine in them. They might have more puffs in there. Because they're unregulated, they're more unpredictable in terms of their risk, because there might be other substances in there as well, chemicals that haven't been tested for this use. And there is growing evidence that they are health-harming products. Now, Cancer Research UK has spoken out about this. WHO has spoken out about this. There are future plans on more banning of ads, on making these less available to young people, on having bans for anyone born after a certain year. But it's all taking time, and we know these are out there. In the UK, of these little disposable ones, 5 million are thrown away every week. This stat really resonates with young people when they realize just how much waste there is out there. These aren't recycled properly most of the time. About 85% of people don't recycle these properly. They can cause fires if they're improperly recycled due to the batteries in there. So with all this environmental impact on top of just the health risk. And for some people, that resonates more than telling them how bad it is for them. When we're looking at alcohol, it's worth knowing what your units are. And so we have different amounts of liquid for 1 unit based on strength. alcohol in the UK is always labelled. Now, for adults, they're told not to exceed more than 14 units a week. That is spread out across the week. That's not all one night. That means having nights off in between there as well. So it's worth considering if you are someone who drinks and you have young people in the house with you when you are drinking, that is going to have an impact on their behavior. It's actually more determining, it has a bigger impact on their behavior than you saying they shouldn't drink. Something they're more likely to latch onto is seeing that as accepted and normal behavior. But it's also, what is your relationship with alcohol? I'm not trying to call anyone out. You know, we all have different reactions to drinking and different reasons for doing this stuff. But if you are someone who, you know, cracks open a bottle of wine when you're having a difficult time, are you sending a message that that is a regular coping mechanism? Is that the way that someone should deal with their issues? How much are you drinking? It's just something worth considering. It's going to be different for you and it's going to be different for each person. But my real thing there is just that it does impact young people. So children under 15 are told not to drink alcohol at all. That's because it harms the developing brain, bones, and hormones. So they're already going through loads of changes. Their brain's still developing till they're 25, and alcohol can impact that much more than a fully developed brain. And they're much more likely to develop issues with alcohol when they're older, whether it's alcoholism, problematic drinking. Now, these units are also really handy because it tells us how long it takes to process alcohol, which is an hour for every unit, and you can't count the first hour. So 3 units take 4 hours to process. So in terms of our tips for people, for young people, and if you're having a conversation with them, it's worth telling them to eat carbs before so they have food. They might forget, you know, they might go out, drink, they're going to get much more drunk without eating carbs. Have water whilst they are out, pacing themselves, so not just having drink after drink after drink, chasing the being drunk rather than chasing the I should be having a nice time whilst I'm also drinking. And knowing that it is acceptable to not drink, have a soft drink, tell someone you don't feel like it, that you want to have this instead. There are different ways of approaching not drinking, and a lot of venues are very supportive of that. So if you are planning on hosting a party, or rather your young person's planning on hosting a party, it's worth having a few checks and balances in place. Make sure the parties are invitation only. So that is, don't post it on a reel, on an Instagram story saying party at mine tonight, who wants to show up? You want to make sure you know who's there. I know that's an extreme example, but it does still happen. So make sure it's invite only and you have an idea who's coming. You want to make sure that there's an adult there supervising. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be sat in the room whilst kids are playing spin the bottle or playing cards or whatever else. It means maybe be in the next room and you're there and you're available. You might watch your own thing, be reading a book on the side, and you can always check in. If they need you, you are there. It's really there, being there for support. As an adult, you are responsible for alcohol that is being served, that's provided for anyone under 18. So make sure that other parents know what's going on. Maybe have a conversation with them in advance. You'd want the same the other way around. Long alcoholic drinks are better. And really what we're talking about here is not just having pure spirits or people having lots of beers. So yeah, you want to have your soft drinks ready. You want to make sure that they can mix and maybe have a bit less alcohol and pace themselves. Don't put everything out at once. They will drink it all at once. So save a few bottles to the side. Have food there, whether it's a big plate of nachos, whether it's a nice curry you've wanted to make, something that they can nibble at, have a bit of food. People might have forgotten to eat, and that does stack up. So I work in, again, nightclubs where we deal a lot with people who come out after work, they don't have dinner, and then a few hours later, after a few beers, they crash, fall asleep, need to lie down, stuff like that. Eating does help at that point, but it also helps a lot sooner rather before they're drunk. Now, it's worthwhile for your teenager to put them in charge, make them responsible for the guests. So if you've got an issue with someone, they can sort it and they know who's there. Also gives them a lot more autonomy to feel responsible for what's going on, rather than you being the host and like you still have your responsibilities, but it is their party and they are hosting everyone. So again, I mentioned it before, if your young person's going to a different party, maybe have a chat with the adults in advance about what arrangements they have set up. Are you picking someone up at a certain time? Are people staying the night? How are people getting home as well? Things like that, and who's attending. So we have a separate resource on this, both video and a quick guide, so do have a look at that as well. So cannabis, we get asked a lot of questions about cannabis, but in short, THC is the substance that causes the high, that might make people feel more anxious, more paranoid, more panicky. So the more like stimulating brain mental effects, and the risk of that and the harm of that can be minimized or reduced rather by CBD. And we've seen CBD around a lot in soft drinks, in massage oil, in any sort of random old product out there. So there is a lot of CBD out there. But in cannabis, when it is smoked, we have both these substances in there. Now, some people might be told that their cannabis has more CBD in it, that it is more relaxing. But we know in the UK, you've got some stats here up to 2014, the amount of THC has consistently gone up and the amount of CBD has pretty much stayed the same. So there is more risk of people having these effects like anxiety, paranoia, and being more overwhelmed. So we do see a link between cannabis and underachievement because of the effect it has on learning and memory. You'll see people with reduced mood and motivation as well. So it's more difficult to study, more difficult to kind of push through. We know for drug services, 87% of young people are there because of cannabis, and specifically addiction to cannabis. Cannabis just keeps coming up when we're looking at problems with substances with young people. It's really overrepresented compared to other substances. People are 3 times more likely to develop common mental health disorders. Now, what we're getting at with here, because there's quite a lot to unpick there, and this is the question we're asked by young people in terms of, well, what's the risk? And other people in other countries might have access to cannabis, and there might be space for cannabis to be a medicine. But we know young people in particular, they might still be finding out what is normal for them in terms of anxious feelings, in terms of depressed feelings. So feeling sad and feeling anxious and stressed, can be normal normal symptoms of being a young person, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are clinically depressed or have a clinical diagnosis of anxiety. But maybe in future they would develop that. They might be likely to develop that as young adults, but they don't know that until they've reached that age. So we have this link between people smoking cannabis at a younger age and developing mental health conditions in early adulthood, and it's really difficult to unpick that, but what we do know is that there's this consistent trend between the two. So it's really worth just checking in if someone is already feeling like this, whether there are other strategies that you could implement instead, because cannabis does also come up a lot in terms of self-medicating. So yeah, again, you see the stats around psychosis as well. Psychosis linked consistently to daily cannabis use as well. There's a lot of cannabis being confiscated, whether it's smoked or whether it's as edible, so that's gummies. They can look just like regular old candy. And the issue with these as well is that they can have spice in them, which is synthetic cannabinoids, or used to be legal highs. These can have a much faster effect. Not so much the edibles. Edibles take longer to have an effect on people than smoked cannabis, but spice as a substance compared to the actual regular old cannabis can have a much quicker effect in terms of people being overwhelmed. So in this case, where someone, if they had a regular cannabis gummy, it would have been 2 hours and then they had an effect and they feel quite overwhelmed. Here, if someone were to smoke spice, it could overwhelm them immediately. And instead, you're just delaying that by 2 hours. So we have an even greater risk, but delayed, which means people can't manage it and can't time it properly, which is an even bigger risk on top of that as well. Very risky. It's what I'm trying to get at. It's a lot of risks added together. I'm going to leave some questions till later, actually. If you want to pop any questions on this in the Q&A, then we can answer them at the end as well, because I'm going to hand back to Asha. But of course, we do have resources on our website, specifically about different substances as well, and some organizations later. And again, yeah, keep up to date because these substances change all the time. So I'll hand back to Asha.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I think I will share my screen actually. So it's always nice to be in control of your own screen. Okay. Thank you so much. So I'm going to look a little bit at decision making. Just one comment I noticed that had come through. Someone said that they didn't understand kind of what went wrong for Dan very clearly. The kind of point that was being made is that one of the boys had got in touch with the dealer, got 5 bags of white powder that looked identical. and they just gave them out at random. And the one that Dan got that any of them could have got turned out to be 12 times stronger than had caused fatality in the past. The kind of issue being that with illegal drugs, you just don't know what you're getting. And so sometimes they can be just incredibly strong. And that's one of the things that went wrong for Dan. But of course, you know, lots of room for contamination and so on, as Dan was describing. And also someone in the comments said, you know, I've heard that sometimes there can be cement and concrete and stuff like that in there. Absolutely. They are just completely unknown until you get a proper kind of chemical analysis done, which is not something that is particularly easily available. So just kind of looking really at motivations, and a question for you. I'm going to launch a poll actually for this to kind of gauge your kind of thoughts on this. And it's around what percentage of 15-year-olds do you think have been offered illegal drugs? And then there's also a second question on that poll, if you just scroll down a little bit, around what percentage you think have actually tried illegal drugs. So it should have popped up on your screen. So you can just kind of tick boxes on there, and I can see the answers coming through. Thank you very much. And then I'll just give it a little bit longer before I just kind of show you what you've all thought. I just wanted to highlight the fact that at the foundation, everything that we do is evidence-based. That's really important, particularly when we're talking to students, but of course when we're talking to anybody, because what we want to do is enable them to make informed choices. And they're only going to be able to do that when they're kind of in the situations that they're in. They have to do it for themselves for a start, but we want them to be making those choices based on the latest, most relevant, up-to-date information for them, and it is different according to kind of different year groups and so on. So thank you very much, those of you who have participated in that. So I'm just going to end that now, and I'm just sharing the results, and you should be able to see there that the majority of you think that in terms of 15-year-olds being offered, it was kind of between 40 and 60%, but a few of you thinking that it was kind of higher than that, but also quite a significant number of you thinking that it was maybe less. And in terms of those who have been offered, the most popular answer was kind of 20 to 40%. A few of you thinking more, but maybe some more of you thinking just under. So kind of in light of that, I'm going to show you some data that comes from the NHS survey that Sam actually mentioned earlier in terms of the places that young people go. If they're after helpful information about alcohol and drugs. And I'm going to show you the data that comes through, again, from that same survey. It's a really big piece of work done by the NHS every couple of years. And on the last occasion, they asked around 9,000 11 to 15-year-olds a whole host of questions. It's all done anonymously, so that nobody has any kind of interest in exaggerating or underplaying anything. So it gives us a good benchmark for kind of what is going on. So from that, you can see that around half of 15-year-olds said that they'd been offered, and around a third of them had tried them. So you were pretty much spot on in what you were saying. 13% of them said that they'd actually tried drugs in the last month. Because it does look at 11 to 15-year-olds, we can also see the data for 11-year-olds, top end of primary. I always find this terrifying. Over 10% said that they've been offered drugs, and 7% said that they had tried them. So this stuff, it's really kind of around, it feels accessible, it can feel quite normalized in various ways, as Sam was talking about with things like cannabis. And so it's just kind of good to have that sense of kind of what actually is going on for young people. In terms of where they say that they get them from, over half say that they get them from a friend, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment, and around a quarter say a dealer. In terms of where they say they get them from, it's kind of round and about really, but you know, some of them will say someone else's house, so that's why kind of knowing the legal side of things really does matter. And the thing around parties is really interesting because it's just hovering around the 10% mark in terms of this survey. Now, we also survey students, as you know, from that substance information that Sam showed you earlier. We survey 15 to 18-year-olds, year 11 and upwards, and around 75 to 80%, when we say, where do you think people are getting hold of drugs, they will say parties and gatherings. And it's one of those things that we kind of talk to them about. You know, we're assuming that you don't invite external drug dealers to those kind of events. So it is kind of one or two people probably getting some stuff in and passing it on. And this concept of social supply is a really, really big issue for young people. As I say, I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit more detail in a moment. The kind of rise of social media has really fueled accessibility. It's taken away quite a lot of fear. You don't have to try and identify who the person is and approach them. We're doing quite a lot of work in Scotland at the moment, and some of the students up there have just commented that getting hold of drugs, feels as easy, if not easier, than ordering a pizza. It is just that easy for them. And we'd found it quite difficult to get a handle on the presence of drugs on social media. So we did our own research on it a couple of years ago, and you can see the data there. 1 in 3 15-year-olds said that they'd seen drugs for sale on social media. The most commonplace was Snapchat, but TikTok and Instagram also came quite highly. And 1 in 3 who'd bought drugs had bought them from social media. We are repeating that survey right now, and it will be interesting to see how the data has shifted on that, because it was, you know, COVID at that time, so maybe people were more involved in that world, but equally maybe that is something that has massively grown. So just coming back to the legal side of things, I'm sure you've heard of the terms possession and supply. Possession is about drugs for one person's use. They do not have to be on their person. They could be in their locker, in their car, they could be, you know, in their bedroom, at home. It would still be considered a possession charge for that individual, because it's kind of what the intention is behind it. Now, some very specific information for parents and caregivers is that if you take drugs from your child, effectively you are now in possession of them, and it means that you need to destroy them, flush them down the toilet, or hand them into the police in a really kind of timely manner. It is also an offence to allow drug use in your home. When it comes to supply, any occasion in which drugs change hands, that is regarded as supply in the eyes of the law, and money doesn't need to be involved. And this thing around social supply is a significant issue. You saw from the NHS survey, over half of 11 to 15-year-olds say that they would get drugs from a friend. And you know, it's much more than just a theoretical risk. We see these cases every few years. This is one from a few years ago. This young lady, well educated, she was a graduate, she and a group of friends had agreed that they were going to take ecstasy. One of them was the one who got them in from a dealer. She passed it on, one of them died, and so the buck stopped with her because they didn't catch anybody further up the chain, and she did go to jail for that. So this is a really significant thing. The penalties for supply are harsher than they are for possession, because supply has the potential to cause harm to many more people than just one individual. There are lots of other criminal offences, of course, things like drink and drug driving. Drug driving actually is now more prevalent in the UK than drink driving, according to police data. There's also a lot of kind of antisocial behaviour things, also consent issues. But just having any form of criminal record can have really long-term consequences in ways that people just don't anticipate. They take for granted their right to travel, but actually getting a visa can be really difficult if you've got some kind of drugs conviction. Even things like going to college, going to university, getting a job, having a drugs charge is something that would need to be disclosed, and can just get in the way of, as I say, things that they take for granted as being in their future. So another poll for you that I'm going to launch now. What do you think young people cite as the reason for using drugs on the first occasion that they did so? So that should have launched onto your screens. Let me know what you think. There's just one question on this one. So let me know what you think is kind of the predominant reason, really. And you can see that there's various different things there. And the data that I'm going to show you again will be from that NHS digital survey. So I'll just give it a little bit longer for as many of you as possible to give me your responses. Thank you very much. You're a very responsive lot, actually. Thank you. It's really nice. Makes it much more interesting for us, and hopefully for you as well. Okay, so I think most of you have done it now, so I'm just going to end it and I'm going to share the results with you. And the thing that's come out top is my friends were doing it. Curiosity, you feel, is the kind of second most common reason, and wanting to kind of forget problems like a coping strategy, that's one that one person has mentioned as well. So I'm just going to stop sharing that. You may need to make that disappear from your screen depending on how you've got it set up. And I'm going to show you what the NHS survey shows us. So you can see there, it's a bit of a complicated table, this, but actually curiosity comes up as the highest reason at pretty much every age. Just not wanting to know what it feels like, wanting to experience the effects, that is also something that comes out highly. And then peer pressure is usually kind of around the third thing. Boredom definitely plays a part, particularly it seems for 13-year-olds. Again, this data was kind of collected during COVID, so I do wonder that maybe had played a part as well. But that thing around wanting to forget problems, that had really increased from the previous occasion on which this survey was done. And that was kind of supported by other data that came out. So this was a big piece of work done by the Mix, which is a really great organisation providing lots of information and support for young people. But you can see there it had gone up from 12% to 21% as people saying that they'd used it as a kind of escape. We know that young people are really struggling in terms of their mental health, and we also know that it can be quite hard to access services. But it's one of those things where it's really important to kind of just reinforce that there aren't any easy solutions, and sometimes things that you think will help you forget even for a few moments, actually they can make things a lot worse, as Sam was describing with cannabis, which is one of those things that people will use thinking it's going to help them feel less stressed, more chilled out, you know, less anxious, but actually it is a significant risk factor for mental health problems. So actually it increases the risk of those things happening. In terms of decision making, to understand how young people come to their decisions, it's really important to understand adolescent brain changes, which is a huge process of development that happens from the age of 10 to around 25. It's really important because it prepares young people for adulthood and being independent of their caregivers. And it's the biggest process of change that happens in the brain from 0 to 2. And if you think what happens from when someone is a newborn to when they're a toddler, they learn such massive amounts of things. This is how significant adolescence is. Now, the problem is that all the bits of the brain don't develop and mature at the same rate as each other. And the first bit of the brain that matures is the limbic system. That is the bit that is all about kind of feelings and emotions. It's also where the relationship between risk and reward sits. But it's also the bit that kind of makes us kind of really sensitive to what people think of us, and particularly people of our own age. Now, this means that there is a bit of a mismatch between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, which is the last bit of the brain to develop and connect. And that is the bit of the brain that is all about kind of what we would consider executive function, planning, organizing, problem solving, kind of thinking things through as well, learning from things that go wrong, self-regulation, and so on. And it's also the bit of the brain that helps someone kind of feel confident about who they are. And that bit sometimes is not totally there until the mid-20s. And this mismatch between the emotional center of the brain, the limbic system, and the kind of rational, reasonable bit of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, means that as a teenager, it takes longer to think things through, and it is much harder to manage that kind of very impulsive, in the moment response that they have. And this is all happening at the time when young people are moving away from their parents, from their caregivers, in a way that they need to do, but they are spending much more time with their friends. And because they are much more sensitive to what their friends think of them, whether they would approve or disapprove, how that kind of feels in the moment, while they gauge risk the same as adults, they actually will take more risks when they're with their peers and when emotions are running high or they're feeling under pressure. And if you think about the situation in which they're going to be making decisions about drugs, chances are all of these three things are going to be going on. The risk taking, it really peaks in that early teenage time, and then it kind of decreases into adulthood. But of course, there is a massive range of this because some people are natural risk takers, whereas some people are much more risk averse. And it's good to think about peer pressure in the form, bear with me, in the form of thinking about a frog. Now, if you put a frog into boiling water, the frog realizes that something is wrong and it will immediately jump out. And peer pressure can feel like that, where you know that something is happening that is around you. You can identify it. It's really easy to identify, not necessarily easy to handle, but at least it's quite overt. And that's that kind of situation where someone's saying, oh, go on, you need to do this thing, because if you don't, something awful is going to happen to you. I'm never going to talk to you again. But peer pressure can be much, much more subtle. And again, if you take the frog, you put it into cold water, and then you very gradually increase the heat of that water, the frog does not realize that anything is changing around it, and it will just sit there. And you just end up with a boiled frog, which kind of nobody wants. And peer pressure can feel like that, where things just change around them, and it's much more difficult to perceive. And it's much more difficult to perceive that that individual is changing to kind of fit in with what they think is going on around them. And they can have a massive shift in a very short space of time, just based on kind of what they think they should be doing, even though the pressure might actually be in their own head. But it also can be that thing where people are just saying, oh, it will be fine, go on, what's the worst that could happen? Where, and it means that they kind of take that leap into something that they, on their own, they just wouldn't think about doing. Now, in terms of supporting young people with their decision making, a really important thing to embed with them is that most young people are not taking drugs or drinking too much. Any form of statistic shows this repeatedly at any age. And it's really easy for them to think everybody's doing it. And probably people will say to them at some point, everybody's doing it. But in reality, knowing that they aren't, it actually enables them to kind of lean into something that is making them feel uncomfortable, kind of lean into that discomfort and actually know that it is okay to kind of resist things. But there are also some ways that parents and caregivers can help. Just talk to them about planning reasons ahead that they could use to get out of a situation that they don't feel comfortable in. My parents would kill me, it's against my religion, I've got a big sports match or music exam tomorrow, that kind of thing. If they've thought about it beforehand, they're much more likely to be able to say it when they're put on the spot. I'm thinking about what their motivation is, actually what matters to them rather than the kind of people around them, but also just appreciating that when people are saying, oh, go on, it's fine, that actually isn't about them wanting that the best for that person that they're saying that to. It's about kind of them wanting to kind of take people with them almost. It's a very selfish motivation as opposed to about the well-being of others. Just thinking about what they would do if they were outside the social context and on their own, tying into their core values, what does feel right. But also, actually, if they just say, I just need to think about it, that means that they can access their prefrontal cortex, that logical piece of their brain. And so just saying, how would you kind of just buy yourself a little bit of time? What would you say to do that? And it could be, I need to think about it, I'll come back to you, I'm just going to the toilet. There's lots of things that they can say or do. There may be situations or groups that they want to avoid where the pressure can feel too much. And again, just kind of talking to them about that means that they can identify that and just have prepared that a little bit ahead. But also knowing that actually it is okay to be doing different things. And a good analogy to draw is that within a friendship group, chances are the individuals will like different music. They might like different sports or different sporting teams. Having those differences doesn't mean that they can't be friends. They absolutely can. And in fact, they respect those differences in each other. And so with this kind of situation, it should really be the same kind of thing. Also, if they are feeling uncomfortable with something, chances are other people are too. And being that person who says, do you know what, I'm not sure about this, or I don't want to do it, it can actually empower other people to know that it is okay to kind of back away from it. And that's a really positive way of using peer influence. There are a lot of protective factors as well. Some of them are very much around the individual, and parents and caregivers have a massive role to play in supporting these. Positive physical development, being able to kind of regulate their emotions themselves, feeling good about themselves. That doesn't mean telling that your child that they're wonderful all the time, but it's just about them having a sense of their self-worth and kind of encouraging them to solve problems on their own, not just jumping in and kind of resolving things for them, but kind of helping them find a way through them. That's really important in terms of developing coping skills and resilience. Having a sense of a world that is bigger than them. that is a really good thing to do. So that could be through extracurricular activities, it could be through a part-time job, or being part of a kind of religious community or cultural community. And of course, family plays a massive role in this. And it's about having those kind of really positive, supportive relationships where people feel connected and there's really good lines of communication. Now, boundaries matter. They should not be draconian and overly strict, because then that means that they can just rebel against them, and then the moment they break it, then kind of all bets are off, and they can do anything. So it's about having structure and limits and expectations that are made very clear, but are also open to negotiation as they get older, because what your expectations are for an 11-year-old are going to be different for what they are for a 16-year-old. And so it's just making sure that they know where that is. Clear boundaries and limits, they have a massive role to play in kind of protecting young people. Now, the conversation that you have kind of preemptively, quite generally, about drugs, there's kind of things to bear in mind around that. It's really good to start early when they are kind of more open to listening to you, but it is never too late. You don't have to be an expert, but it is good to kind of keep your knowledge as up to date as you can. So use resources, follow us on social media. We keep abreast of these things and kind of highlight things. So, and it will just appear in your socials. But maybe kind of bookmark just a few places to have a look at. That thing around just taking and making opportunities, just those sideways conversations in the car, gaming together, watching TV, what's going on for you, and just finding out actually what's going on for their friends as well, because they'll often talk about what a friend is doing rather than talking about what they're doing. And just thinking about when and where works best, because when they're just about to head out to a party, they're not going to be open to it. So having kind of thinking about more generally how you're going to kind of broach this subject, because you just want it to be kind of a comfortable conversation within your household. Really important to listen as well and emphasize those social norms, like actually the majority of young people are not drinking too much, they're not taking drugs. That really matters. And just kind of going back to it, repetition and reinforcement helps with these things. This isn't a kind of one-shot thing. And that's the same with anything really to do with education. We don't teach division once in primary school and then just leave it forever. We build on it. And your child's situations are going to change, so it's important that you're kind of revisiting these things as they grow, and they are in different places. It's really important to be prepared for tricky questions, things like, did you ever take drugs, mum or dad? And do think about how you're going to handle it. You know your child best, but also do think about where they're coming from with that question. And do think about the context as well, and the way that you approach that answer, because it's really actually a great opportunity to put in a bit of education. Well, when I was at university, a few people did smoke weed, but actually I saw that it didn't go too well for some of them, and we were a lot older than people are now. And did you know that it's a completely different drug, because the THC content is now way higher than it used to be, 15, 20 years ago. So it's just a good way of kind of having a really kind of wide-reaching conversation. So that thing in our focus groups that we've done with teenagers, that what they want is they want to have these conversations, but they don't want it to feel awkward. So try and make it comfortable. Try and avoid negativity, because actually what that can just do is make them shut down and become very defensive. You don't want to catastrophize and talk about the worst thing that could happen, but instead kind of help them find solutions, problem solving, because then when they do come across it in real life, they'll know how to navigate it. But also let them say what they want to say. Don't kind of finish their sentences or jump to conclusions, because you want to hear where they're coming from on all of these kind of things. If it all goes wrong, please don't give up, because it does really matter. And by broaching it once, you're leaving the door open, not just for them, but for yourself as well. Some stuff that you can pass on in terms of safety measures. Really important that everybody has their emergency contact details populated on their phone. If something happens to someone, chances are someone will dig their phone out from their pocket or their coat or their bag, and of course it will be locked. Now, on that lock screen, you can phone an ambulance, but if you've populated your emergency contact, it just means that whoever is the kind of significant person will pop up on there as well. And for your child, presumably it would be mum or dad and their phone number. And it just means that if something did happen, that your contact details would be there available for someone to call you. as I say, it's an important thing for everybody. Do think about setting up an escape plan with your children. This is where you have an agreement where you have decided a code. I have this agreement with my 2 teenage daughters. If they are ever in a situation in which they don't feel comfortable, they put a single X on our family WhatsApp group. And that's because if someone grabs their phone, it just looks like they sent a kiss to their mum, which isn't the coolest thing in the world. But, equally, it's kind of a normal thing that you might do. Now, I know that if I receive that message, that they don't feel great. And so I phone them. And it means that they can just say, without losing face in front of their friends, my mum's just called, I've got to go. And the thing that they like to say is, oh, she's locked herself out of the house because it makes me look silly. I don't care what they say, because I just think if they don't feel safe, they have a right to get safe. And I don't ask any questions at all, because safety nets have to be unconditional. So do think about setting this kind of system up. It can be really valuable if you need it. Hopefully people won't, but you could agree whatever code you wanted. In this example, it's a particular emoji. You just mustn't use it for anything else on its own. A couple of apps to put on their phones, St John's Ambulance and What 3 Words. These both work offline to give first aid information or to give you a really precise location that is just 3 words, that is a 3-meter square. And then you can give that 3-word location to emergency services, or they could send it to you and you can reverse engineer it and just work out exactly where they are if you needed to pick them up, for example, that kind of thing. And please do impress upon them that it is always okay for them to call emergency services. There's a lot of fear among young people about calling 999, but the reality is that the priority of the emergency services is just providing the help that is needed. It's not about getting people into trouble. So do impress upon them that if they are ever in a situation where they feel that it is warranted, they should feel that they can do that. Some kind of staying safe information. The only way to eliminate drug-related risk is to not use drugs at all. And just remember that most people aren't at any age, but sometimes your child may be in a situation with someone who's using drugs, or maybe themselves, but we find that framing it around if you're with someone who's using drugs means that people tend to be more receptive. So it's that stuff around people making informed decisions, and those decisions should involve harm reduction measures if they are hell-bent on going forward, and harm reduction is different for different substances, so it's very important to kind of get into the specifics. That thing around just checking in with each other, because friends know how each other are normally, and they will be able to spot early signs that something isn't going as it should, because that could include things like inadvertent drug use from spiked drinks or vapes containing drugs other than just nicotine, which we're hearing about quite a lot. Strangers will only notice something is wrong when it's really going wrong, like someone being really sick or passing out. Mixing is always a really bad idea. That includes alcohol with any drug, as well as drugs together. It includes medication, it includes over-the-counter remedies. All kinds of things can happen. And do get drugs tested if testing is available. Starting low and going slow is the kind of baseline of every harm reduction message to do with drug use. Start with a tiny amount, give it plenty of time. More is not better. And this is one of the things that went wrong for Dan, because he'd held back on drinking his water that had the ecstasy powder in it. One of his friends had noticed and wanted to kind of say, if you're not sure, then just don't bother, just dump it. But he also didn't want to draw attention to it in front of the other boys that they were with. And just before they got off the last train, before they went to this rave, one of the other boys noticed and said, are you not having that? And Dan could easily have said no, but he didn't. Instead, he picked it up and he drank it down in one. And that is one of the many things that went wrong for him, because he had no way therefore of kind of controlling how much he was taking in, because he just took what was a massive overdose in one hit. If he'd been drinking it slowly, he would have realized he was much more affected than the others, and he could have stopped and got medical help. So take something from that. Really important to think about food and water. They can have a huge impact if you're thinking about the situations that people are at, if they're in at a concert or they're at a festival. Maybe they've been drinking, maybe they haven't eaten, maybe they're dehydrated. All of those things can really influence the effects that the drugs will be having. And of course, do remember all of those risk factors, including things like mental state, because drugs tend to take the head in the direction it's already pointed. So someone who starts from a position of feeling stressed or angry or low, they're much more likely to have a bad experience. But also not forgetting the legal side of things as well. So just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please pop those into the Q&A. I've made a note of a few that have come through the chat as well. But I'm going to stop here and I'm going to hand over to Sam, and he's going to take you through the next section of this webinar.
So there's a few things to keep in mind before we have these conversations and try and find out what's going on with your young person. What is it, how would we actually find out that a young person might be taking drugs? We get asked this, we have concerned parents. Well, first of all, they might tell you. They might tell you very explicitly. They might hint at it. They might say it's a friend of theirs that has an interest or is curious about one substance or a different one, or they might ask you questions as well, whether you have any experience. Someone else might tell you, whether that's staff at school, whether it's a friend of theirs. You see the effects or the after effects. So either they're intoxicated or maybe it's how they're acting the next day. And of course, you could be finding drugs themselves or paraphernalia. So things like small baggies. So this is kind of the same size bag that you would get for like a spare button, but without a spare button in it. And usually things like a crystal or a powder. These come in all shapes and sizes and different colors and patterns, but it ranges from about this big, which is about that one there, to much bigger. It depends on the substance. So for instance, cannabis might be in a larger substance. Some of it might be very explicit in it being for drugs, like having actual pictures of substances on there, little smiley faces, whatever. Here, this is a cracker for nitrous oxide. So this would be used to break those small canisters that we saw earlier by twisting. You might have seen larger sort of dispensers that you would have seen in a cafe for making whipped cream. That also gets used for laughing gas just going into balloons. Things like grinders, bags, extra tobacco pouches that aren't just for the tobacco, but maybe have extra space to be rolling things like joints or spliffs. Really powerful vapes so smoking paraphernalia, vapes themselves. Again, that you might see so these are a few different ones. You might see the smaller colored ones that I showed earlier, the single-use ones. People might be using their own sort of fancy tooled up things. Lighters and things like volatile substances, so sprays, lighter fluid, can be an indicator of substance use, of smoking, but also themselves could be used as substances. And this is particularly worrying because substance use like this, so volatile gases, can kill instantly. If someone huffs the wrong thing or too quickly or has a reaction to it, it can kill instantly. It's very scary, to be honest. And of course, things like pills. So that might be also might be more non-prescription medication. It might indicate that they're self-medicating to get past the after effects that they're having of a substance, to keep them awake more if they've been feeling tired, if they've been going out, or it might be controlled medication. So is it just painkillers that they already have, or is it maybe prescription medication that they've gotten illegally? So there's a few signs to look out for. So it might be things like social changes. Now, some of these are a bit tricky because as your young people get older, they'll be going through some of these changes naturally. But it is things like people hanging out on their own, a real sudden change of friends. So whether that is people you wouldn't normally expect them to hang out with. So and you're kind of wondering, what is it that they have in common? What are they talking about? Are there maybe more conversations about drugs? Are drugs more normalized, or conversations around going out and having behaviors that are associated with drug use? Are you seeing more of that? It might be some physical changes. So maybe they are caring for themselves less. They might try like what I'm not getting at here is things like someone's decided to get a new haircut. We're really looking at like, is someone letting themselves go? Are they less focused on it? Are they gaining a lot of weight suddenly? Are they eating more? Or is it that they're eating a lot less because they're more stimulated or spending less time focusing on food? Now, these in and of themselves, these are already possibly worrying things or could be signs of other things that they are dealing with that could then be associated with drug use as well. Now, there might be unusual smells in terms of their breath, so you might get slightly sweeter smell. It might just be something just unexpected. changes to their pupil dilation, so having very large pupils when you're not in a dark room. It might be pinpoint pupils for things like opiates, but the dilated pupils are for things like MDMA, leads to the dilated pupils. Very red eyes associated with cannabis. Now, you'd be trying to look for other symptoms at the same time to do with this as well. Now, you might have noticed things like their performance in school. So either their grades are dropping, or maybe there's issues with attendance. They might be less responsive, and we're really looking at things like a Monday or a Tuesday. Maybe they've been out on the weekend and they're not as well rested. So how's that then presenting in how they are acting at school? So maybe they're late. They might just not really fully be involved and not attending sessions. And maybe at worst, we have things like self-harm as well, and just really sort of erratic behavior. So things like lashing out, being more angry, being more irritable, that doesn't match up with what you're aware of and what they're going through. Is there something else we should be worried about? Or is there something else that they're dealing with? Now, when we talk about drug use, it's very easy to immediately start talking about addiction and persistently problematic use, but there's a few different tiers before that. So we start off with more occasional use. So someone might try something occasionally. They might try it as a one-off. So this might be more in that curiosity stage that we mentioned when we talk about why young people might be interested in trying something. This might also still be from peer pressure because they want to fit in, or maybe it's a new group that they're hanging out with and they want to do the same as what they're doing. Then we have our regular use. So when we go from occasional to regular, what we see is you might start seeing more of a change in the behaviors in terms of what they're doing at the same time. So maybe they are being less sociable, they're going out less, and they're focusing more on the drugs. And then when we go into addiction, it's really when we start seeing more of a big lifestyle change and more of their life being built around the substance use, rather than substance use being something that is, say, to enhance or to be combined with something they're already engaging with. So if you were to kind of go from one to the next, imagine someone likes to watch movies and play games, something like that. It might be an activity they like anyway. It might be an activity that then picks up as they smoke more cannabis, say, and it's something that enhances their enjoyment of that, up to they're spending a lot of time gaming and watching films and less time socializing, less time doing other activities, because this is an activity that they associate with this substance. So we have some substances that people combine with a hobby, say, or combined with a certain social group, with a set group of friends. So they spend more time with those friends and less with other friends. So that the stuff to really notice there is like, oh, is there something that they're not doing anymore? Are they not bothered about school? Are they not bothered about a hobby or an interest that they had before? And maybe they're still interested in it. It's just their lifestyle slowly changed to make more time and space for this drug use or for habits associated with this drug use. So in terms of finding out what is actually a problem for a young person, it's worth having a bit of a conversation with them. This might be a conversation to just have with yourself initially in terms of what you have perceived. So it's really worth considering, is this a regular behavior? Is this something that's happening every day? Is it something that they clearly have a need for? And in terms of that need as well, do they get anxious if they run out, if they don't have enough, if they're not engaging with this behavior? Are they really upset at the notion of not being able to do this? And really, we're talking about like irritability, being annoyed. Also, can they not sleep? So if anyone here has been a smoker and has quit smoking, you'll be familiar with these. So there's things like people want to have a cigarette very early on in the day. They're anxious about having a few cigarettes left in their pack. They get annoyed when they are out of cigarettes. Classic example. More people familiar with it, but we see the same with other substances, because that's just a classic pattern of addiction, of wanting to engage with this behavior, getting comfort from it, and being annoyed because that need can't be met. And of course, how big is it? So that's what I was hinting at earlier with addiction, whether there are other behaviors and other habits that are kind of falling by the wayside. So in terms of having a conversation, if you suspect or actually know your child is using drugs, Ash has made some really good points in terms of, kind of how lovingly and how nicely we want to have this conversation, and how we don't want anyone putting their guard up. So really, we want this to be a conversation that is both going both ways. and you want to be able to be ready to also have some questions coming back to you. This is something you are trying to work out together. This isn't you having to know exactly what is going on and why. And I say that because these are all things you could be very concerned about, but we need to make sure that this concern is really just coming through as care for this young person, as care for your child and love for your child, and trying to support them so it's less of an issue for them, rather than making your worry their problem, because then they're going to shut off because they don't want to upset you, they don't want to let you down, disappoint you, all these feelings that might come up. So, of course, do ask them. And we have heard from young people, this is from our own research into this, they really just don't want to be interrupted. It's really helpful for them to feel like they're being heard, to be understood, to not be judged, to be empathized with. So that all comes into that questioning. It's really just asking open questions. It's not making assumptions going into it, and just hearing what they have to say. If they don't want to talk about it, maybe give them time, come back to it. If someone is engaging in the behavior, so you're worried they're off to friends, they're heading off, that isn't the time to have a strong or stern approach and to tell them off or to tell them you don't approve. It's really about telling them, okay, now might not be the right time. I want to talk about this. When is a good time for you? And so they're ready for it. They know what to expect. They don't feel like they're suddenly being jumped on or like lured into a trap about something that they might not initially be worried about. Or if they are worried about it, they want to make sure that they feel safe, that they can talk about it. If they are continuing to use substances, or if their friends are, it's really worth talking harm reduction. So that's things like having enough to eat, having enough water, those different tips that Fiona mentioned earlier, making sure that you know where they are, that they know how to get out of a situation they don't want to be in, so they don't feel on their own. So if they are not in a place, and I'm speaking more here for like entrenched drug using behavior, or someone who can't control their use, if they are still deciding to work on that and they're making their way back, you're doing as much as you can to support them, to put them further along the line of changing their behavior. So you are trying to boost them up and give them tips, so you are getting them into a place where they feel comfortable talking to you about changing. So that is if they're continuing to use and they don't want to talk about it, still just give them advice in terms of reducing their harms. So we have a few resources, both With You, which used to be Addiction, and Smoke Free from the government, are great resources. But besides just reading, there's a few other ways to engage. So I'm going to hand over actually. Well, before that, this is a key point. Don't give up, because it isn't just these organizations. It isn't just you. There are a lot of organizations out there where you can talk to other parents, other families. So there are things like Drug Fam, AdFam. These are really great support groups. Someone on our team actually works for them. This means you can have, an anonymous conversation with other families and sit down, and you might have someone else who's going through something similar. You might be able to get very good support. You will be able to get support from your GP, who might be able to find local services, which you can also find through places like Talk to Frank or even the NHS. Teams have appreciated that, because they want to have that conversation. They don't want it to be something that they're hiding, that you're judging them for or aren't happy with, but they don't know how to have that conversation. So do just engage with that. Now, I'm going to hand back actually for this, because you have some great local services. So Drug Hub UK are a part of this call. They have loads of resources, as I was saying to them before, that I really love for young people. So just want to see if you're back.
Yeah, hi, I'm back.
Hi, Diane.
Hi, thanks for that. So, as we were saying, we within your local area, there are youth substance misuse teams. We have one in Cumberland, and the contact details are there for the two offices in Cumberland. And we've also got one, I will apologise because Westmoreland is spelled incorrectly on that, I've just noticed. But there's contact details there for Westmoreland and Furness. One of the things that we also do is we run Drug Hub UK, which is on Instagram and is on YouTube. We've got daily posts. Young people can DM the team directly through that. And also on our YouTube channel, we after we do any work with a young person, we ask them for feedback about what they've liked about the service, where they feel that we need to improve. And one of the things that we heard back from the young people who'd accessed the service was that actually some of the resources that we used needed to improve. So what we've done is we've done some filming with some older Cumbrian young adults with lived experience of substance misuse, and those films are accessible on our YouTube channel. And it's just about older young people talking in areas that our young people recognise, in accents that our young people recognise, about their experience, their lived experience. One of the things that I think is maybe worth just picking up on what was being said is,
Sure,
as
please.
we always ask young people about their experience, and some of the things that they say is that I was helped to make better choices. I didn't feel judged, and I felt like I could speak freely. And I think that's really important. We're not there to judge, we're there to support young people. We also have a parent and carer support forum, and they meet county-wide, and we can refer parents into that. So if you are worried at all and you want to make contact, then please do so, and we can signpost you, or we can help you directly.
Thank you, Diane. Yeah,
No
so
worries.
you really have a great resource there. You have multiple groups to talk to. Again, I said to you before, and Diane, I love your resource for young people. I mean, I love what you've written for parents as well, but if you are in a position where you want to get a bit more backup and have a few more, all our resources are evidence-based, and for us it's really great seeing an organization like this work have accessible materials that are still evidence-based. So it's not young people just Googling something or going on a forum and hearing other drug users or people talking about their own personal experiences that aren't really like checked through. So it's really great to have, and I'm really glad that you have brought people in who do have their own experiences, but it's still done through a service and links into local support. So yeah, do check that out and do link your young people into that. Now we also have Drug Link. So this is a service that runs once a week. This is also complete. It's more relaxed, so it's informal, it's anonymous, it's non-judgmental. You can just hop in. It's on Zoom, so if you want to have a one-to-one conversation with the facility, you can do that at the end. And throughout, it's really if you're concerned and you're still trying to sort of figure out what's going on, but also how to have some of these conversations. So again, you have another great resource for here. We're going to have all of this for you in the chat and afterwards as well. So honestly, do just have a look through what's available for you. There's plenty out there. That includes, of course, our website. So we have resources for parents and carers. We add new resources when new substances come out, when there are particular behaviors we're worried about, whether it's spiked vapes, whether it's nicotine pouches or things like so snus. Slight difference there, but again, we get asked about both. There is Frank, which is a great resource if you, particularly for parents, if you want to hear just how much is out there, because there's so many substances listed on there. And Crew, which is a harm reduction organization based in Edinburgh. They've been around for about 30 years. They work with young people as well. And there's the Alcohol Education Trust. That's actually now the Talk About Trust. And Drink Aware. So Talk About is focused on alcohol, but also risk-taking, young people's behavior. And Drink Aware gives you a few sort of interesting sort of tests in terms of weighing up different types of alcohol to each other. The mix is for under 25s, so that's mental health support, and just kind of figuring stuff out for young people. There's teen tips as well, because young people still need that support, whether they're teens or going into early adulthood. And then with Young Minds and Hopeline UK, which is for mental health support for young people, and for suicide or suicide prevention and mental health support as well. So that's more like Samaritans, but for young people. So it's someone they can just call, pick up, no judgment, and just chat to someone. So we have a poll to put out, which should pop up for you now. We'll tell you a bit more about just our work and leave things open for questions at the end as well.
So just to add about the survey, the poll that
Yeah.
we've just launched on your screens, it really helps us in terms of tailoring our provision, kind of, refining it and so on. We're a really small team. We work in around 750 schools and colleges now, but there really aren't very many of us. You've kind of got a quarter of us here. it really, it means that we can be very adaptable about what we're doing. So you know, please do know that we do definitely look at all that, just like we looked at the survey beforehand. But also this this webinar has actually been funded by the National Lottery Community Fund, which I should have mentioned at the beginning but was on some of the slides. And when we have testimonials and kind of accounts from people just saying that we think it's useful, we think it's helpful, that really helps us when it comes to securing funding. So that's kind of another really compelling reason. So please do, as many of you as possible, do give us some feedback using that poll. It's really quick and easy to do. So please do that. So we have had a few questions, haven't we? One that came through, there was a bit of a comment about how even until quite recently, more generally, alcohol is very kind of socially acceptable, and it's only recently that it's stopped kind of sponsorship of kind of big events and things like that. So yeah, absolutely, and that just really ties into that kind of quite confused messaging that young people can pick up on. You know, that that also ties into vaping when they see vapes on their socials and stuff like that. Yeah.
I was going to say that there are quite a few festivals, and there's a bit of a concept of festivals having brandivals, which was just something a colleague of mine made up, but is now actually backed up by research that a lot of these large scale events to keep running need a lot of funding, and they get a lot of that funding from alcohol. So you'll see like the Strongbow stage, or you know, a lager stage, and it'll be named after that, and you'll be stood there and they'll only serve this beverage. And people are exposed to that. And you also see parties, festivals, which have you know, nicotine pouches being handed out, or there'll be like an immersive experience or like a secret stage, which will be branded completely in like a vape product, or completely in some kind of nicotine pouch.
Yeah,
Which,
absolutely. And some of the really big venues as well. So I was at the O2 recently, and there were, you know, vaping pop-ups, there were nicotine pouch pop-ups, and yeah, there are the brands around alcohol. They're very definitely there. And it's obviously they financially support these events, but in other ways it's very kind of overt marketing. So just something to kind of be aware of. But there was a question that also came through. A couple of the ones that have come through the survey we've answered really. How hopefully you've kind of picked up some tips on allowing your child autonomy to make decisions and enjoy time with friends, but protecting them from negative influences. So hopefully you've picked up a bit on that. And another question was around the most common drugs taken by 15-year-olds and older. So, you know, we've covered that too. But one of them was around any guidance or support techniques to discuss suicide via a drugs overdose with a child who may be aware that someone in the family has attempted this. And so Hopeline UK is a really brilliant organisation, suicide prevention charity. So it's worth looking on there for some tips and advice, but some of the other stuff really around it can feel a little bit counter, but some of the advice around talking about people taking their own lives is actually to just be quite open and direct about it, not shy away from terms like suicide, which for those of you who are older like me, as opposed to younger like Sam, will know that that is something that feels very alien, but actually the research shows that actually it's a much better thing to kind of bring these topics out into the open. Again, it's about making it a conversation that you can have, and if there's terminology that you're not using, that actually can act as a barrier. But also just talk to your child, you know, what is their knowledge, what is their kind of understanding around it, because you probably want to find out where they are on this and then kind of take it from there. Is there anything that you'd want to add to that, Sam?
yeah, I have a few things going on around my mind in terms of drug deaths, where of course you've heard Dan's story, and we do share Dan's story in schools, and we do talk about it very frankly and honestly and openly, and we give details of what happened. Now that changes between, you know, year 7 and 6th form. But the questions are there and the interest is there, and young people want to know more about what happened to him, and they want to know more about what he was going through or how his parents felt, and also specifics like, yes, how did he drink it, and how did that come to pass, and what went wrong that evening and leading up to it. So I think still having that conversation, and I know we're talking there about an accidental drug death, and I appreciate I don't know the circumstances of this death, but it is worth talking about and not shying away from, because I mean, for us, we aren't trying to scare anyone with this. It is scary, and it is sad, and it is upsetting, but also it is a very real risk, and it's an avoidable risk, and it is something that is worth talking about. So that's it in terms of like having it linked into harm reduction messaging. But I appreciate, I'd agree more with what you said, Asha, in terms of how you're managing just talking about a very difficult topic. It might be worth looking at a few of those resources there as well.
Absolutely, yes. So Hopeline UK's got loads of stuff on there, so do have a look at that. What I would say is when we talk about Dan's story, the reason that we talk about it is it's so relatable, and they can imagine themselves. People can't imagine themselves being addicted or things like that, or being in prison, but they can imagine themselves going to a party, or they can imagine a friend going to a party. So they can kind of relate to various kind of different aspects of it, and that's why it kind of gets their attention and makes them think, oh, this is relevant to me. And so that is why we talk about Dan's story. It's not, as Sam says, it's not to shock them or kind of, it's not that at all. That isn't effective, actually. Just saying don't do this because this terrible thing can happen, evidence shows that just isn't effective. So just a little bit of advice there. We've got one more slide to show you, because I think that's it for the questions.
Yes, and I think we're saying
so
thank you, and just because we realize people want to get more information. Oh, okay.
Have I knocked you off? I'm so sorry.
That's fine. Yes.
So sorry, I was mid screen share, but we were sharing the same one anyway. You
And the
can see it
QR's
both.
up.
Yeah,
Yes.
we have. So in terms of you being able to access the information leaflet that we talked about, also all of those videos and written information about different substances, but also different topics like teenage brain development, going to festivals, alcohol in social situations, spiking. There's loads of stuff there. So do have a look on our website and on our socials, but also you can access links for the books that Fiona has written for parents to buy. The first one, I Wish I'd Known, the name is familiar because it's the same name as this. And basically that book is an expanded parents webinar. Lots of information about what happened to Dan, but also loads and loads more information about drugs and decisions in young people. And again, all evidence-based, but with that kind of lived experience aspect. Her second book, Talking the Tough Stuff with Teens, again, evidence-based, lived experience, starting from the really kind of what can feel small but annoying, screen time and curfews, to massive stuff like gender dysphoria and self-harm and suicidal ideation and eating disorders. So she's written these two books, and we know that lots of people find them really useful. Lots of schools often will have a copy on the shelf because the staff find it really useful to dip in and out of. So you can buy those on our website as well. If you get them through our website, then all of the profit comes to the foundation. So you've got a QR code and a URL there, and I've just popped those into the chat as well. So you could open them in a different tab or a different window if you wanted to come back to it later. We are also a charity, and we never want the ability of a school to pay to get in the way of the work that we do. So we've been really lucky in your area that the local authorities have funded this tour of the play, and all of the schools are being encouraged to access our PSHE resources for the schools to deliver themselves. They're all available free of charge from our website, but obviously there is a cost to the work that we do. And so if you are able to make a donation, or better still, be a regular donor, which is called being a friend of the foundation, and we would suggest £10 per month, which is for our 10th year, but whatever you can give is brilliant. People like that are just lifeblood to small charities like us, and if you do become a friend of the foundation, you could choose to get one of Fiona's book as a kind of welcome gift. So there's another QR code and a URL there, and we've put the URL into the chat as well. We're going to disappear now. We're going to leave this up just for a couple of moments in case anybody wants to kind of capture those. And we do realise that kind of we came about we come to you from an organisation that came about because something really, really bad happened, and that is a worst case scenario. But by coming to this, you've done a really brilliant thing, because you will be much more able, hopefully, to have conversations with your children that can just make such a massive difference to them, and look after each other as well, because that really matters. So thank you very much for being with us. Do go well. And that's it from us. I don't know if Diane wants to come back and say anything as well.
Just thank you to everybody for attending, and if you have got any queries, or if you want to just have a chat with somebody from the team, then please either have a look at Drug Hub UK on Instagram, or contact one of the team, and you can find us just by googling youth substance misuse, either Cumberland or Westmoreland and Furness.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you for having us in your homes. We appreciate, you know, it can feel a lot after a long day doing whatever it is that you're doing. So thank you very much. As I say, Sam and I are going to disappear, and Diane, and we'll just leave this screen up for a couple more minutes before we shut it down completely. Thank you.